The grandmother sat in the same armchair she had occupied for nearly 15 years, the one positioned beside the narrow window that faced the old maple tree. Evening light stretched long and thin across the carpet, touching the edges of framed photographs that no one looked at anymore. Her hands rested folded in her lap, thin skin resting over bones that had carried far more weight than age alone could explain. In that stillness, she began remembering the day she realized that love, when mixed with greed, did not arrive loudly. It arrived politely, with paperwork and smiles, and it waited until trust had grown old and tired. She was 71 then, though her body felt older. Time had a way of settling unevenly into her joints and thoughts. Her name was Margaret Holloway, and she had lived in that house longer than she had lived anywhere else. The house had once echoed with the heavy steps of a husband who came home smelling of dust and engine oil, and later with the lighter steps of a little boy running down the hallway, laughing at nothing at all. Those sounds had faded slowly, replaced by quiet mornings, careful routines, and the ticking of clocks she never bothered to fix. That afternoon had begun like any other. Tea cooling too fast on the table, sunlight slipping away before she felt ready for it. The mail lay unopened near the door, its weight more emotional than physical. She had learned over the years that letters rarely carried good news once a woman reached a certain age. They carried reminders, instructions, warnings, and requests, rarely affection. The envelope that mattered was thicker than the rest, cream-colored, typed address, her full name written out carefully, as if formality itself could disguise intention. She had known immediately that it came from her son, Daniel. He had always been precise when he wanted something. Margaret did not open it right away. She rarely did anymore. Instead, she sat back down, closed her eyes, and let her mind drift to an earlier version of herself. A woman who believed that raising a child with honesty guaranteed honesty in return. That belief had once been as solid as the foundation of the house beneath her feet. Daniel had been born during a winter storm, the kind that shut down roads and kept neighbors away. Margaret remembered holding him near the hospital window, watching snow blur the world into something soft and forgiving. His father, Thomas, had been alive then, strong, certain. He had believed that if you worked hard and stayed quiet, life would reward you eventually. That belief had died before he did. Thomas had left behind more than grief when his heart failed. He had left behind land, a modest manufacturing business, and something Margaret never spoke about openly: reserves. Carefully grown, quietly protected. Money that was never meant to impress anyone, only to secure the future. Margaret had guarded it the way she guarded her memories, selectively, cautiously, without apology. Daniel grew up knowing stability, not wealth. That was deliberate. Margaret believed children should learn value before comfort. He went to good schools, wore clean clothes, and never lacked essentials, but he did not grow up entitled. Or so she thought. The first shift happened years later, after Daniel married Rebecca. Rebecca arrived into Margaret's life like a carefully wrapped package. Polite smile, controlled warmth, eyes that measured rooms and conversations before fully entering them. She spoke softly, but she listened sharply. Margaret noticed these things, though she never named them out loud. At her age, she had learned that naming truths too early only made people defensive. At first, visits became more frequent. Daniel called more often, not long conversations, efficient ones. Updates, questions, casual mentions of finances disguised as concern. Margaret answered simply, always gently redirecting towards safer topics. Weather, health, memories of Thomas. Then came the suggestions: downsizing, estate planning, simplifying things before it becomes stressful. Daniel framed it as love. Rebecca framed it as responsibility. Margaret heard something else beneath their words: impatience. The envelope waited on the table as dusk deepened. When Margaret finally opened it, her hands were steady. The contents were not surprising, only confirming. Inside were documents prepared by a private advisory firm, polished language, reassuring phrases, a proposal to consolidate assets for family efficiency, a recommendation that management authority be transferred to Daniel, with Rebecca listed as secondary executor. It was written as if the decision had already been made. Margaret read every word slowly, not because she struggled to understand, but because she wanted to feel where the document tightened around her. She had learned long ago that betrayal left fingerprints in language. Words like optimize, streamline, protect. Words that sounded kind, but left little room to refuse. She folded the papers neatly and placed them back inside the envelope. Her face remained calm. No shaking, no tears, no anger yet. What stirred instead was something quieter and more dangerous: recognition. She had seen this before, not in Daniel, but in people who circled Thomas's business during its early success. Men who smiled too much, advisors who appeared suddenly when numbers grew, people who spoke of legacy while positioning themselves to inherit it. Margaret rose slowly and walked to the window. Outside, the maple tree stood exactly where it always had, roots deep, bark cracked by years of storms. She had once told Thomas that the tree reminded her of aging, not beautiful in the way people praised youth, but dignified in its survival. He had laughed and said that trees were smarter than people. They stayed where they belonged. That night, Margaret did not call Daniel. She did not confront Rebecca. She did not mention the envelope to anyone. Instead, she went upstairs to the small room she kept locked, not out of fear, but out of discipline. Inside were folders, journals, and records that told a truer story of her life than most people knew. She sat at the narrow desk and opened the oldest notebook. Her handwriting, once firm, now leaned slightly to the right. The pages were filled with notes Thomas had insisted she keep. Dates, amounts, decisions, safeguards. He had always said that memory faded, but paper endured. Margaret traced her fingers along familiar entries. She felt Thomas there with her, not emotionally, but practically. He had prepared her for many things: loneliness, responsibility, suspicion. What he had not prepared her for was the possibility that the threat would wear her child's face. In the days that followed, Daniel called more often. His tone remained affectionate, but urgency crept in around the edges. Rebecca sent emails filled with helpful links and gentle reminders. Margaret responded slowly, always polite, always vague. She allowed them to believe she was considering it. That was her first mistake, because patience, when mistaken for weakness, invites escalation. One morning, Margaret received a visit she had not been warned about. A legal representative, courteous, efficient, documents already signed not by her, but by Daniel, papers requesting disclosure, transparency, family alignment. Margaret listened without interrupting. She nodded when appropriate. She offered tea. Inside, something ancient and protective woke up. She realized then that this was no longer about concern or planning. It was about access, control, ownership disguised as care. When the man left, Margaret closed the door gently and leaned against it for a moment longer than necessary. Her reflection stared back at her from the hallway mirror, silver hair neatly pulled back, eyes still sharp, mouth set in a line learned through years of endurance. She did not cry. She sat back down in her chair as the light shifted again, darker this time. And in that quiet room, she made a decision that would change the remaining years of her life. She would not confront her son directly. Not yet. She would let him reveal himself fully, because a betrayal half seen could still be denied. But a betrayal allowed to unfold exposed its own truth. And Margaret Holloway had lived long enough to know that truth, once seen clearly, was the only thing that could finally set a family free or tear it apart forever. Margaret remained seated in that same armchair as the days unfolded, each one bringing small changes that might have gone unnoticed by someone younger or less attentive. At her age, attention had become instinct rather than effort. She noticed when Daniel's voice softened in a way that felt practiced. She noticed when Rebecca's emails grew warmer while their timing grew sharper. She noticed how concern was always paired with suggestion, and how suggestion quietly leaned toward instruction. The house itself seemed to listen. Floorboards settled differently at night. The refrigerator hummed louder in the silence. Even the maple tree outside appeared heavier, its branches bowing slightly as autumn crept closer. Margaret felt time pressing in, not urgently, but persistently, like a hand placed on her back. guiding her toward a destination she had not agreed to reach. She remembered a different season, decades earlier, when Daniel had come home from college angry and idealistic, convinced the world owed him more than it was giving. He had paced the living room then, gesturing wildly, insisting that ambition was wasted if it was not rewarded quickly. Thomas had listened from the kitchen doorway, arms folded, eyes calm. Later that night, after Daniel had gone to bed, Thomas had said something Margaret never forgot. He had said that hunger, when left unchecked, did not disappear with success. It only learned better manners. At the time, Margaret had brushed the comment aside. Mothers often did when it came to their children. Love softened warnings. Time sharpened them again. The pressure increased subtly. Daniel began stopping by unannounced, always bringing something small as if to soften the intrusion. Fresh bread, soup from a place Margaret liked, a new blanket Rebecca had picked out. The gestures were thoughtful, but they carried weight. Gifts always did when given with expectation. Margaret accepted them graciously. She always had. She asked about their lives, about work, about plans. She listened carefully, storing away details that contradicted one another. She did not challenge inconsistencies. She had learned that people revealed more when they believed they were not being tested. One afternoon, Daniel mentioned the business, the manufacturing operation Thomas had built from nothing, and which Margaret still quietly owned through layers of trusts and holdings. Daniel spoke about modernizing it, about bringing in partners, about scaling. His voice carried excitement, but beneath it was impatience again, sharper now, less disguised. Margaret nodded, her gaze drifting to the window. She said nothing about how the business no longer required scaling, or partners, or rescue. She did not mention that it had been structured specifically to remain stable without interference. Thomas had designed it that way after watching friends lose everything chasing expansion they did not need. Daniel interpreted her silence as openness. Rebecca followed up with spreadsheets emailed late at night, framed as ideas rather than demands. They showed projections, valuations, timelines. Margaret recognized immediately that the numbers assumed authority they did not yet possess. They assumed her absence. She remembered holding Daniel's hand when he was small, guiding him across busy streets. She had squeezed tightly then, believing that holding on was protection. Now she realized that letting go carefully, deliberately, was the truer test of love. As weeks passed, Margaret felt the shape of her solitude more clearly. Friends had passed on or moved away. Neighbors waved, but did not linger. The world had grown efficient, less patient with slowness. Even grief had been streamlined, condensed into cards and brief visits. There were nights when Margaret questioned herself. Nights when memory softened sharp edges and guilt crept in quietly. She wondered if she had been too guarded, too distant, too unwilling to to share what she had worked to preserve. She wondered if secrecy had taught Daniel entitlement instead of respect. Those thoughts came late, when the house was quiet enough to hear her own breathing. But each morning, clarity returned. Rebecca's involvement became more direct. She suggested meeting with advisors together. She mentioned estate laws changing quickly. She raised concerns about complications if something unexpected happened. Margaret noticed how the word something carried more weight than it should have. Margaret responded with kindness and delay. She scheduled medical appointments she did not need. She claimed fatigue. She deferred meetings. She let them feel helpful while keeping them at arm's length. Behind the scenes, she began organizing her records. Slowly, methodically, she reread Thomas's notes and her own. She traced decisions back to their origins, reminding herself not just of what she had, but why she had it. She thought often about forgiveness, about whether it could exist without accountability, about whether protecting oneself from family required cruelty or simply clarity. She did not arrive at answers quickly. At her age, rushing felt dishonest. The turning point arrived quietly on a Tuesday afternoon that looked like any other. Daniel came by alone that day. No gifts, no small talk. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, posture straighter than usual. Margaret noticed the shift immediately. This was not a visit. It was a step. He spoke about responsibility, about legacy, about how difficult it was to watch her carry everything alone. He spoke of worry, of fear, of love. Margaret listened, her hands folded exactly as they were now in the armchair. Years later, she noticed how he avoided mentioning Rebecca by name, as if distance lent credibility. She noticed how often he used the word we. When he finished, he slid a single sheet of paper across the table. Not a contract, a letter, written carefully, reasonable in tone. It requested temporary authority, limited, he said, over certain assets. Just to help, just in case. Margaret looked at the paper without touching it. In that moment, something settled inside her. Not anger, not sorrow, acceptance. She realized that Daniel no longer saw her as a person navigating the end of a long life. He saw her as an obstacle between himself and what he believed was already his. That realization hurt more than any document ever could. Margaret told him she would consider it. He left looking relieved. That night, she returned to her chair and sat longer than usual, watching darkness gather in corners she could no longer fully see. She felt the weight of years pressing against her ribs, not painfully, but insistently. Time was no longer abstract. It was present, attentive, waiting. She thought about what revenge truly meant at her age. It was not spectacle. It was not punishment. It was protection shaped by truth. Margaret knew then that the circle around her was closing, but she also knew something Daniel did not. Circles could be traps. and she was no longer afraid of being alone inside one. Margaret remained in her armchair long after the house fell silent again, her body still, while her thoughts moved carefully through the past. Age had taught her that memory was not something that drifted randomly. It surfaced when needed, carrying lessons that had been set aside, not forgotten. On that night, memory did not arrive gently. It arrived with purpose. She thought about the first time she had ever said no to Daniel. He had been 9 years old and determined to have something beyond their means at the time. She remembered his anger, the way he had retreated inward, silent for days. Thomas had warned her then not to rush reconciliation. Children, he said, needed to learn that love survived disappointment. Margaret had held her ground, and eventually Daniel had returned to her, softer, quieter, changed in a way she had mistaken for growth. Now, decades later, she recognized the pattern with painful clarity. The silence, the patience, the waiting, they were not signs of maturity. They were strategies. The next morning, Margaret made a decision that felt heavier than signing any document ever could. She contacted the attorney Thomas had trusted, a man older than herself now, whose voice carried the calm of someone who had seen families fracture and still believed in preparation. She did not explain everything at once. She did not need to. The moment she mentioned Daniel's request, the man exhaled slowly, as if bracing for something he had always expected might come. Margaret asked him to do 3 things. First, to audit every access point to her assets, every outdated signature, every dormant authorization, every forgotten convenience that time had made dangerous. Second, to create a decoy structure, something plausible, modest, tempting. Third, to remain invisible. Margaret did not want confrontation yet. She wanted clarity. While those preparations began quietly, she continued her routines, unchanged. She attended her weekly grocery trip. She watered the plants she no longer remembered planting. She sat in her chair each evening, watching light fade from familiar walls. To anyone watching, she would have appeared unchanged. That was intentional. Daniel and Rebecca grew bolder. Rebecca's tone shifted first. The warmth sharpened. Emails became more frequent, more insistent. She framed urgency as protection, as responsibility. Margaret noticed how often Rebecca spoke of the future, as if Margaret were not included in it. Daniel followed with visits that felt rehearsed. He spoke of stress, of pressure, of needing relief. He spoke of how difficult it was to watch his mother manage everything alone. Margaret listened, aware that he had never once asked her if she felt alone. The decoy documents were completed quietly. They described a woman nearing the end of her financial independence, a woman who had done well, but not extraordinarily, a woman whose resources, once liquidated, would barely cover long-term care and modest comfort. Margaret placed the folder where it would be found. She did not hide it. She left it in a drawer she knew Daniel had opened before. She allowed Rebecca to see it accidentally during a visit. She spoke lightly of downsizing, of simplifying, of being tired. The effect was immediate. Daniel's concern sharpened into calculation. Rebecca's politeness thinned into impatience. They asked more direct questions. They made suggestions that sounded less like help and more like instruction. Margaret watched carefully. What hurt most was not the betrayal itself. It was the absence of hesitation. There was no pause, no moment of reconsideration, no sign that love might slow ambition. Once they believed the ground beneath her was weakening, they moved quickly. The first attempt came quietly. Margaret received a call from her bank late one evening. A routine verification, they said. An attempt to access an account using credentials that should no longer have existed. The voice on the phone was calm, professional. Margaret thanked them and confirmed what they already knew. After the call ended, she sat very still. She knew whose credentials those were. She knew who had helped set them up decades earlier, back when trust was simple and technology was new. She knew exactly how access had been gained. What unsettled her was not the attempt itself. It was the confidence behind it. Someone believed they had the right. Margaret did not confront Daniel. Not yet. Instead, she waited. The next visit confirmed everything. Daniel arrived looking tense. Rebecca stayed in the car. Margaret noticed that too. Daniel spoke carefully, asking questions that revealed more than he intended. He spoke about streamlining again, about avoiding complications, about acting before things became difficult. Margaret watched him closely, the way she once had when he was learning to lie. She recognized the telltale signs, the stillness, the rehearsed calm, the slight tightening of the jaw. She told him she trusted him. The words tasted bitter even as she said them, but they were necessary. That night, Margaret did not sleep. She lay in bed listening to the house settle, the way it had done for decades. She thought about Thomas, about the life they had built deliberately, carefully, without spectacle. She thought about how easily it could be undone by someone who believed inheritance meant entitlement. By morning, the betrayal was no longer theoretical. Her attorney confirmed it. The digital trail was clear. The access attempt had come from a device registered to Rebecca. The location matched their home. Margaret closed her eyes as she absorbed the information. The pain was sharp, but clean. There was no confusion left. She understood now that this was not a misunderstanding. It was a plan. She also understood something else. If she acted too quickly, she would lose Daniel completely. If she acted too slowly, she would lose everything else. That balance became her burden. Margaret chose a third path. She arranged a family meeting. She framed it as reconciliation, as clarity, as love. She invited Daniel and Rebecca to the house for lunch. She cooked the meal herself, moving slowly, deliberately, the way she always had. She set the table with care. She watched their faces as they arrived. Rebecca's smile did not reach her eyes. Daniel looked relieved, almost triumphant. They believed they were close to victory. Margaret sat with them at the table, her posture relaxed, her tone gentle. She spoke of memory, of Thomas, of wanting peace. She spoke of being tired. Then she told them she had decided to move forward with restructuring on her terms. The relief was immediate and poorly concealed. Margaret saw everything then: the hunger, the anticipation, the absence of guilt. She did not reveal the details. She said only that paperwork would follow. After they left, Margaret returned to her chair and let the house go quiet again. Her chest felt heavy, but her mind was clear. She had crossed a line she could not uncross. She was no longer defending herself. She was guiding the truth toward the light. And once truth reached that place, no amount of love could put it back in the dark. Margaret stayed seated in her armchair long after Daniel and Rebecca left the house that afternoon, the silence settling around her like a heavy blanket. She did not move immediately. At her age, stillness had become a form of listening. The walls held echoes, not of voices, but of intentions that had passed through them and lingered. She let those intentions reveal themselves slowly, without interruption. She knew now that Daniel and Rebecca believed the next step was inevitable. That belief was dangerous. People made their greatest mistakes when certainty replaced caution. Margaret's days took on a new rhythm. Outwardly, nothing changed. She continued to attend church on Sundays, sitting in the same pew, nodding politely to familiar faces. She walked slowly through the grocery aisles, selecting the same brands she always had. She waved to neighbors she barely knew anymore. She remained the predictable, aging woman her son believed he understood. But inwardly, she was preparing. Her attorney worked quietly, carefully, never contacting Daniel or Rebecca directly. Records were reorganized. Authorizations were tightened. Timelines were reconstructed. Every interaction from the past year was documented, cross-referenced, preserved. Margaret did not rush the process. Rushed truth was easy to dismiss. Carefully assembled truth was not. She spent evenings reviewing old letters Thomas had written her, not for comfort, but for clarity. He had always been deliberate with words. When he spoke of people, he spoke in patterns, not moments. He believed that character revealed itself not in crisis, but in repetition. Margaret recognized the repetition now. Rebecca began calling more often, her voice unusually warm, her concern unusually specific. She asked about medical appointments, about fatigue, about long-term care options. She spoke about being prepared, as if preparation itself required authority. Daniel followed with questions framed as affection. He asked how Margaret was sleeping, whether she felt safe alone, whether she had considered assisted living. Each question sounded reasonable. To together, they formed a narrative that Margaret no longer recognized as concern. She allowed them to believe she was weakening. She spoke openly of memory lapses that did not exist. She misplaced items intentionally. She asked Daniel to repeat things she already understood. She watched how quickly he adapted to the idea that she was becoming unreliable. What disturbed her most was not how easily he adjusted, but how readily he accepted it. The decisive moment came without warning. Margaret received a formal notice from her bank, not an alert this time, but a request. A request initiated by Daniel, citing concern about her capacity and requesting temporary financial oversight. Attached were documents signed by Rebecca as witness. Included was a physician's letter, vague, non-committal, but enough to raise questions. Margaret read the notice twice, then set it down gently. That night, she sat longer than usual, watching the shadows stretch across the room. The maple tree outside swayed slightly in the wind. She remembered teaching Daniel how to read that tree, how to tell storms from seasons, how to notice when something strong was being tested. He had forgotten that lesson. Margaret contacted her attorney the next morning. This time, she did not ask for restraint. She asked for readiness. The response was immediate. Evidence was organized. Timelines were prepared. Digital records were verified. What had once been suspicion was now documentation. What had once been emotional was now factual. Margaret requested one final meeting. She invited Daniel and Rebecca to the house again, framing it as a necessary step to clear confusion. She mentioned the bank's notice casually, as if grateful for their concern. She did not sound threatened. She sounded relieved. They arrived quickly. Daniel appeared confident. Rebecca appeared composed. Margaret noticed how they sat closer together this time, their posture unified, defensive. She recognized the stance of people who believed they were about to assume control. Margaret spoke slowly, carefully. She thanked them for caring. She acknowledged their efforts. She spoke of fear, not of losing independence, but of losing trust. She asked them directly whether they believed she was no longer capable. Daniel hesitated, just long enough to matter. Rebecca answered for him. Margaret listened without interrupting. Then she asked one simple question. She asked when they had decided to stop asking her and start acting on her behalf. The silence that followed was brief, but telling. Margaret did not accuse. She did not raise her voice. She simply placed a folder on the table. Inside were records, access attempts, emails, timelines, bank logs. She did not explain each one. She did not need to. She watched realization dawn slowly, painfully, across Daniel's face. Rebecca's expression hardened. Margaret felt no triumph, only exhaustion. She told them she would not contest the bank notice publicly. Not yet. She told them she would give them time to reconsider their approach. She told them she hoped they would choose honesty over escalation. They left without arguing. That night, Margaret felt the weight of what she had done settle fully. She had crossed from mother to adversary. She had chosen protection over reconciliation. She wondered if forgiveness would still be possible afterward. But she also knew this: forgiveness without truth was not mercy. It was surrender. And Margaret Holloway had not lived this long to surrender quietly. Margaret remained seated in her armchair as she remembered the days that followed that last meeting. Days that felt heavier than any she had known since Thomas died. The house seemed to breathe differently then, as if it sensed that something fundamental had shifted within its walls. Silence no longer felt peaceful. It felt anticipatory. Daniel did not call for 3 days. That absence spoke louder than any confrontation could have. For most of Margaret's life, Daniel's silence had meant sulking, retreat, a child's attempt to regain control through withdrawal. Now it meant strategy. It meant consultation. It meant the quiet assembling of forces. Rebecca, however, could not stay silent. Her messages arrived carefully spaced, each one framed as concern, each one carrying an edge that Margaret had never heard before. She wrote about stress, about misunderstandings, about how difficult it was to manage emotions when everyone just wanted what was best. She suggested neutral mediators. She suggested compromise. She suggested that Margaret's resistance might cause permanent damage. Margaret read each message once and did not respond. Instead, she focused on the physical world around her. She polished the wooden arms of her chair with slow, deliberate movements. She reorganized drawers that did not need organizing. She touched the familiar objects Thomas had left behind, grounding herself in reality when her thoughts threatened to spiral into grief. Aging did not prepare a person for betrayal. It only removed the illusions that once softened it. The final blow arrived, disguised as professionalism. Margaret received notice of an emergency hearing. Daniel had formally petitioned for temporary guardianship, citing cognitive decline, financial mismanagement, and risk to assets. The language was clinical, detached, devastating. Attached were statements. Some were distorted versions of truths Margaret herself had shared in vulnerability. Others were outright fabrications. Margaret read the notice slowly, then folded it and placed it on the table beside her. She did not cry. She had already mourned the version of Daniel who would never have done this. What remained was someone she did not fully recognize, someone shaped by ambition, fear, and entitlement, someone who believed love could be overridden by law. Margaret's attorney arrived that evening, sitting across from her in the living room. His presence was steady, familiar. He did not speak immediately. He allowed Margaret time to process what had become inevitable. She told him she was ready. The hearing was scheduled quickly, too quickly. That, too, revealed urgency, not concern. On the morning of the hearing, Margaret dressed carefully. She chose a simple outfit, understated, dignified. She brushed her hair slowly, hands steady. She sat in her chair for several minutes before leaving, absorbing the room one last time as it was unchanged, familiar, hers. The courtroom was small, quiet, efficient. Margaret took her seat without assistance. She noticed Daniel avoid her eyes. Rebecca sat beside him, posture rigid, expression controlled. Margaret felt no anger toward her then, only clarity. Rebecca was not the architect. She was the accelerator. The proceedings unfolded with polite precision. Statements were read. Concerns were voiced. Margaret listened, calm, attentive, present. She did not interrupt. She did not react. When it was time for her attorney to speak, he did not begin with emotion. He began with facts. He presented records, not selectively, but comprehensively. Access attempts, email correspondence, timelines that revealed coordination rather than concern, digital logs that showed planning rather than panic. He presented evidence of the decoy assets and the real ones, not their value, but their protection. He then presented something Margaret had not asked for, but had anticipated: a recorded message. It was Daniel's voice, captured casually during a conversation months earlier, speaking about moving things along before Margaret changed her mind. The words were not dramatic. They were worse. They were ordinary, practical, unemotional. The room shifted. Margaret watched Daniel's face collapse in real time, not from shock, but from exposure. He had believed his intentions were invisible. He had believed love would excuse preparation. Rebecca spoke then, quickly, defensively. She framed actions as misunderstandings. She spoke of pressure, of fear, of wanting stability. Margaret felt no need to respond. When she was finally asked to speak, she did not address the accusations. She addressed something else entirely. She spoke of trust. She spoke of raising a child to believe effort mattered more than entitlement. She spoke of guarding resources not out of greed, but out of responsibility. She spoke of aging not as decline, but as accumulation, of memory, of discernment. She spoke of how betrayal did not always come with cruelty. Sometimes it arrived wearing the face of love, carrying concern like a shield. She did not ask for forgiveness. She did not accuse. She simply stated that she was capable, informed, and unwilling to surrender her life to people who had decided she was already finished living it. The decision came quickly. The petition was denied, firmly, decisively. Margaret did not look at Daniel as the ruling was read. She looked straight ahead, breathing slowly, grounding herself in the present. The room emptied gradually. People avoided her eyes. Daniel and Rebecca left without speaking to her. Margaret remained seated for a moment longer, absorbing the weight of what had happened. She had won, but victory did not feel like relief. It felt like grief, because the cost had been final. That evening, Margaret returned to her chair as she always did. The house welcomed her back with familiar stillness. The maple tree outside stood unchanged, its branches catching the last light of day. Margaret folded her hands in her lap and closed her eyes. She knew then that the hardest part was still ahead, not protection, not justice, but forgiveness. Not for Daniel, for herself. Margaret returned to her armchair that evening with a weariness deeper than exhaustion, a weariness that came from carrying clarity after years of doubt. The room looked exactly as it always had, and yet it felt altered, as if something invisible had been lifted from the air. The house no longer waited. It simply existed alongside her, without expectation. The days following the hearing unfolded slowly. There were no dramatic confrontations, no sudden apologies, no messages asking to repair what had been broken. Daniel disappeared into silence again, but this time it was not strategic. It was avoidance. Rebecca followed suit, her absence complete, deliberate. Margaret did not reach out. For the first time since Daniel was born, she allowed herself not to chase understanding. That choice came with its own pain. Mornings felt longer. Meals felt quieter. Even the routines she had relied on for comfort carried a new weight. Aging had always been lonely in small, manageable ways. This was different. This was the loneliness of separation, the kind that did not come from loss, but from choice. She thought often about the boy Daniel had been, about the way he used to sit on the floor with his back against her legs while she read, about how safe he had felt leaning his weight against her, trusting that she would hold steady. She wondered when that trust had shifted, when leaning had turned into pushing. Margaret did not romanticize the past. She had lived too long to pretend she had been perfect. She had been strict, reserved, protective to the point of secrecy. She had believed that shielding Daniel from excess would teach humility. Perhaps it had taught resentment instead. These thoughts did not excuse what he had done, but they softened the sharpest edges of her anger. Aging, Margaret realized, did not bring answers. It brought context. Weeks passed. The legal matters settled quietly. Assets were secured permanently. Authority was clarified. Margaret's autonomy was reinforced in writing and in practice. On paper, she was safer than she had ever been. Emotionally, she felt exposed. Friends called when they heard fragments of the story. Some expressed outrage on her behalf. Others offered sympathy wrapped in discomfort. Margaret thanked them all politely and revealed little. She had no interest in becoming a cautionary tale or a subject of gossip. What mattered now was how she would live with what had happened. One afternoon, Margaret found herself standing in the doorway of Daniel's old room. It had been left mostly untouched, a habit she had never questioned before. Dust lay softly on the dresser. The bedspread was neatly folded, as it had been for years. She did not enter, Instead, she closed the door. It was a small act, but it felt significant. Margaret began reclaiming pieces of herself she had set aside quietly over the years. She joined a small reading group at the local library. She walked more often, slowly, feeling the ground beneath her feet instead of rushing through it. She spent afternoons writing letters she did not send, allowing thoughts to exist without destination. Forgiveness began not as a decision, but as a loosening. One evening, as autumn deepened and the maple tree outside surrendered its leaves, Margaret received a letter. It was handwritten. She recognized Daniel's writing immediately. The careful spacing, the deliberate slant, the hesitation between lines. She did not open it right away. She placed it on the table beside her chair and sat with it as the light faded. She thought about what forgiveness might require. Not reconciliation, not trust, simply acknowledgement. When she finally opened the letter, she read it slowly. Daniel did not apologize easily. The words came awkwardly, circling their meaning before landing. He wrote of fear, of pressure, of believing he needed to secure his future before it slipped away. He wrote of convincing himself that Margaret was stronger than she appeared, that she would recover, that no real harm would be done. He did not excuse himself fully. He did not ask for money. He asked for time. Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. Her hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from restraint. She did not respond immediately. Days passed, then weeks. Forgiveness, she learned, could not be rushed any more than trust could be rebuilt. Eventually, Margaret wrote back. Her letter was brief, calm, honest. She told Daniel that she loved him. That love had never been in question, but she also told him that trust had been broken in ways that could not be repaired quickly, if ever. She told him that any future relationship would need to exist without expectation, without entitlement, without pressure. She told him she was still living. She did not promise reunion. She promised truth. When she mailed the letter, Margaret felt something settle inside her, not peace, but balance. She returned to her armchair that evening, folding her hands in her lap, as she often did now. The room was quiet. The air felt lighter. Outside, the maple tree stood nearly bare, its branches exposed, honest, unadorned. Margaret understood then that endings did not always come with closure. Sometimes they came with acceptance. And acceptance, at her age, was its own kind of grace. Margaret sat in her armchair as winter arrived quietly, the way it always did now. Seasons no longer announced themselves with drama. They simply came, settled, and waited. The maple tree outside stood stripped of its leaves, branches dark against a pale sky, honest in its barrenness. She had grown fond of it most in winter. There was no pretending then, nothing hidden. Time moved differently after forgiveness began. Not faster, not slower, just differently. Margaret noticed that her thoughts no longer circled the same questions every night. The sharp edges of memory softened, not erased, but placed where they belonged, in the past, not the present. Daniel wrote again once, a shorter letter, less explanation, more restraint. Margaret read it and placed it beside the first. She did not respond, not out of cruelty, but out of wisdom. Some silences were not punishments, they were boundaries. Rebecca never wrote. That, too, was clarity. Margaret spent more time alone, but it no longer felt like abandonment. It felt chosen. She learned to enjoy the weight of quiet, the way it allowed thoughts to finish themselves without interruption. She reread old books, not searching for new meaning, but for familiar comfort. She listened to music she had loved when Thomas was still alive, letting memory wash over her without resistance. She spoke to Thomas sometimes, not aloud, but internally, the way one did after a lifetime of shared understanding. She imagined what he would have said about everything that had happened. She suspected he would not have been surprised. He had always believed that love required vigilance as much as tenderness. Margaret thought often about legacy. Not money, not property. Those were tools, not truths. Legacy, she realized, was what remained in the absence of control. It was what people carried forward when authority was gone. She decided to write, not letters this time, but reflections. She wrote about mistakes she had made, choices she would repeat, and lessons she wished she had understood sooner. She wrote about fear disguised as protection and love disguised as entitlement. She wrote about aging not as decline, but as refinement. She did not write for Daniel. She wrote for herself. One afternoon, months later, Margaret received a small package. Inside was a simple object, an old photograph frame she had once admired in Daniel's home. There was no note, no explanation, just the frame. Margaret understood the gesture for what it was. Not reconciliation, not repair, an offering, an acknowledgement of distance. She placed the frame on a shelf beside her chair and filled it with a photograph of the maple tree in spring, taken years earlier when leaves had just begun to return. It felt right. As time continued, Margaret's life grew smaller in ways that felt intentional rather than imposed. She no longer measured days by obligations, but by moments of presence. Morning light through the window, the warmth of tea in her hands, the satisfaction of knowing that what she had protected had not been lost. Not the money, not the business, not herself. She understood now that forgiveness was not something she granted once. It was something she practiced quietly, without witnesses, without applause. Margaret Holloway did not reclaim her family the way stories often promised. She reclaimed her dignity, and that, she believed, was enough. On the evening she finished writing her reflections, Margaret sat once more in her armchair, hands folded, breathing steady. The house was quiet, but not empty. It held her history without judgment. The maple tree outside stood ready for another season. Margaret closed her eyes. She had lived a long life. She had loved deeply. She had chosen truth over comfort and peace over control. And as the room darkened gently around her, she felt something rare and precious settle into place. Not happiness, not resolution, but calm.